Hello and welcome to this episode of Cafe New Canadians. Today's topic is the future of work in Canada in the post-COVID-19 world. Today's edition of Cafe New Canadians is presented by New Canadians in collaboration with G.O.A Toronto. New Canadians is a TV and web show for newcomers to Canada, bringing you practical advice on navigating career, life, jobs, and lots more. You can catch New Canadians on Omni TV here in Canada or on their YouTube channel, as well as on their website. My name is Darrell Pinto, and I'm your moderator today. I'm the VP of Research and Industry Advancement at the Canadian Venture Capital and Private Equity Association. Before we get started, I'd like to pass it over to Selvin Colasso, the president of G.O.A Toronto. Selvin, over to you.
Thank you, Darrell. Good evening, everyone. Hope you all are keeping safe and healthy. On behalf of G.O.A Toronto, I would like to welcome you all to this interesting panel discussion in interesting times. We are really excited to bring this to you in collaboration with New Canadians. Those who are not familiar with G.O.A Toronto, we are also known as the Goan Overseas Association. We are a non-for-profit organization established back in 1970. So this year we complete 50 years as a non-for-profit organization. This organization serves various needs right across from professional development, community service, fundraising, social and cultural activities for all age groups. On behalf of this organization, I would like to thank you all for joining in today's panel discussion, and also thank our dynamic panelists, Shamira, Peng, and Ian, and our moderator, Darrell Pinto, for being part of this event. And I hope all of you get some valuable insights from this panel discussion. Thanking you very much. Over to you, Darrell.
Thanks, Selvin. So I'm really excited about our panelists today. We have three amazing individuals. We have Shamira Madhany from World Education Services, Peng Sang from ATS Automation, and Ian Lobo from Accenture. I'm going to jump right into intros by getting you to, before we jump into what you do in your organizations, I want you each to tell me or tell us what's the closest you've ever come to any kind of disruptive event like COVID-19 earlier in your career, and what impact has that had as you've had to adjust? So maybe I'll start with you, Ian.
Thank you, Darrell, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all this evening. For myself, and I expect like many others, nothing at this scale and duration have come across with both the lockdown and economic uncertainty. I think there's also, of course, some of the historic repercussions of the economic contraction from 2008. I think there were some elements of that. Lockdown, I was working in Geneva with the WHO for a couple of years, and during the Icelandic ash cloud, where we were basically just trying to get back home when I was living in London. That was one of the aspects of a piece of this. But actually bringing all of these things together at such a scale, absolutely, dare I say, unprecedented. But I do think, of course, with the resilience, we'll be able to get through this.
Thanks, Ian. Peng, how about yourself? Peng, you're on mute. You need to unmute.
Thanks, Darrell. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for inviting me, Darrell. It's a pleasure to be here to be with you and share my experience. I think the closest thing for me was probably 9/11. I had just started my company, so I was a young entrepreneur. And when the first plane hit the Twin Towers, I was at a client site, and there was an immediate fear, I think, as a new CEO and a new entrepreneur, how that was going to impact the world and impact our business. But, to what Ian said, nothing to the scales where it's literally a global shutdown. And I'm just fortunate that I actually sold my company, or my company's IP, to ATS in December of 2018 and started with ATS on March 2020. I think it's a very difficult time for a lot of small businesses. And I don't know that anyone has ever faced anything like this with respect to all aspects of their lives. So it's definitely a challenging time, but it will make us stronger.
Absolutely. Shamira, how about yourself?
So I'm going to have a slightly different definition, Darrell. More of a lockout than a lockdown. And basically, when I first came to Canada with my parents as a young teenager from Kenya, from East Africa, we came because of the Ugandan refugee expulsion. And basically at that point, the idea was that my dad, who was educated in a British school system, who spoke English fluently, the idea was for him to come here and work in the financial sector. And in fact, after many, many applications, even at the lower levels, he couldn't get a job even as a bookkeeper. And I watched that, and that was hard for a young person coming into this country where I couldn't really understand the barriers. So I saw it more as a lockout, and in fact that left a pretty significant impression on me. And the reason why I am in my career is because I decided at that point I would go to university, go and work as a bureaucrat in government, and change policy so you wouldn't have individuals who are highly educated and skilled who wouldn't be able to enter their occupation. And obviously the pandemic is very different, like Ian and Peng have said. It's completely different from what we've always or known in the world. And so, hopefully this is, as my colleagues have said, will make us resilient and maybe also create some opportunities that we may not have seen coming to us.
Great, thank you all. Now, I'd like to remind the audience, I want to make this as interactive as possible. So you have the ability, if you're watching on Zoom, to use the Q&A tab to type any questions in. And if you're watching on YouTube, the chat box feature. So type your questions in and I'll relay it to the panelists. Shamira, I'm going to stick with you on this. So tell us a little bit about your organization, World Education Services, how it's had to adapt to the pandemic lockdown, and whether you see these adaptations as temporary, I mean, once we get through COVID-19, or what kind of permanence any of these changes have been.
So basically, World Education Services is a not-for-profit organization, and our mission is to ensure that individuals who are highly educated and skilled are able to get their credentials, academic credentials, assessed to Canadian or US standards, and then decision makers like licensing bodies, employers, and post-secondary institutions use these reports to determine whether an individual can continue on their journey. So that's what we do as our core business. The other side of the work that we do is that, in fact, we do surveys. We work with basically other partners, think tanks, research associations to understand whether, in fact, individuals who are coming to Canada and the US are basically able to use their education and skills. We provide almost 500,000 credential evaluations on an annual basis. We have information about over 200 educational institutions. We've been doing this for 40 years in New York initially, and in Canada for the last 20 years. With respect to the pandemic, I mean, literally in March, all our teams suddenly went remote. The work that we do is very much basically applications coming in, generally couriered to us. And so we use the opportunity, Darrell, to try and digitize, so that in fact we use the opportunity to modernize the work that we were doing. So instead of letters coming to us, as much as possible, have institutions send the documents to us remotely. So generally that's what we've done, is try to use this as an opportunity to modernize, but also make it efficient for individuals who want to know where they stand in terms of their educational qualifications.
So COVID's really been a catalyst in that digitization process. I assume that's going to stick around once we get through COVID-19.
Absolutely. We're moving fairly quickly in that regard, and institutions have been very open to that. So it's been great for us.
That's awesome. Peng, how about you at ATS Automation?
So I'm kind of a unique situation because I started with ATS on March 30th at the height of the lockdown. So it's been an interesting experience. But being the VP level, I've sat in a number of the meetings with different executives and all the different changes that they've had to make to accommodate the pandemic. Obviously, ATS as the world's largest assembly company, we are considered a essential business because a big chunk of our business actually is in life science. And one of the initiatives that I took on when I first joined was to work with a different level of government and ATS to work with companies that are, taking on new business dealing with COVID-19 initiatives. So whether it's companies that switch their operation to produce masks or income PPE, ventilators, and be able to introduce them to ATS and their expertise in able to develop equipment. So it's been an interesting experience for me. And I think what I saw with ATS, the biggest change they made was that historically, from what I've seen and what I've heard, having worked with them previous 18 months as the CEO of the company they acquired the IP from, back then it's a typical organization where cubicle engineers are side by side, your typical Dilbert sort of cartoon environment, I would say. But the changes they have made is that they had allowed a lot of the engineers to work from home because of COVID-19. They invest heavily in IT infrastructure and technology so that engineers can work at home. All of our meetings are now encouraged to be on team rather than physical face-to-face. And I think the success of that, I've heard from engineers who, normally don't like that kind of social environment anyway. They actually really enjoy being able to have these team meetings on these virtual meetings like we're doing tonight, because they can get so much more done and it's very efficient. So I can see that continue on with ATS post-pandemic. It's a little bit more challenging on the manufacturing side because people do have to be in the facility to build the equipment. And in that environment, ATS have had to make a lot of adjustment in terms of scheduling different shifts so that there's social distancing. And, I'm not on the operation front. I'm not in the head office, so I don't know what the cost to them is and whether or not that will stay on. But until there's a vaccine found, I think, this is not a short-term solution. I think it's I think we're all mistaken if we think this is a 3 months, 6 months sort of situation. And again, until the vaccine is produced, a working vaccines produced in large volume that we can all get a shot, I think this is going to be quite a while, at least for a couple of years, in my opinion.
And Ian over at Accenture, how's the situation there? And tell us a little bit about what Accenture does.
Right. So Accenture is a global management and technology consulting firm. We have about 520,000 people around the world, providing professional services to companies, governments, and the group I'm with focuses particularly on not-for-profits. So I have a bit more of a global lens, but if I look at our business overall, what are we seeing? So as a consulting organization at the scale that we are, we've got a pretty good finger on the pulse of industry. And so what do we see happening? As Shamira mentioned, given the fact that we do a lot of technology enablement, a lot of our clients that have had that technology readiness, they've kind of been able to quickly move into both continued operations through remote working. We've of course seen drops in demand in opportunities in financial services and some of the products companies, but of course when we're looking at retail with a bit of a pickup, but then a big boom of course with the public sector around the big push and much more momentum. So as we're looking at that, if I look within the firm, I live on airplanes, and so needless to say, that's been a significant change during this. And part of this, what's going to stay is that course, double, triple, and quadruple checking around, do we need to have that meeting in person even when the lockdown comes? So I think that's going to be, you know, a significant change that in a consulting world, you have to be at the client site, or you have to be with the client. You don't even want to be in the office. You know, it's just really working side by side there. So it's been interesting, you know, those dynamics, and also on both sides. One is Accenture for, you know, how we actually go and deliver the projects, but also for clients of, you know, building this new way of working that you don't have to be on site. You're actually moving towards more output driven and getting the results. So I'm seeing that as a major, you know, change, which I think is actually a huge opportunity, because we're actually then moving to a more global model. So if I'm working on a project here in Canada, I can much easier bring in expertise from anywhere in the world in a seamless way. That, you know, sometimes that was limited based on physical proximity to that client, or hopping on an airplane and flying thousands of miles. So I do think this global model, this less travel, more virtual working, really getting sharper with the tools, is absolutely here with us to stay. And of course, you still need that personal connection, which is so integral to this. But I do think that there's a fundamental shift around, you know, how time is going to be allocated, spend on planes, with, of course, you know, environmental impacts of that, as well as the economic costs of that, as we go forward through the recovery.
So it's amazing to hear from all three of you that it's not all gloom and doom. I mean, there are emerging positives coming out of this experience. I mean, a fast tracking digitization over at Shamira's company, less travel, and a creative way to use technology on Ian's side. And Peng, you didn't mention it, but I think ATS also stepped in to help with PPE production, and it really was a pivot away from their normal manufacturing process, I understand.
I wouldn't say that it pivoted away from their normal manufacturing. It's an addition to it. So ATS, as the global leader in developing automation equipment for life science, what it did with the COVID-19 situation is that I say that ATS is kind of like the best kept hidden secret of Canadian superiority in automation, and they haven't broadcast themselves very well over the years. But with this situation, they've gotten a lot of notice from the different level of government to realize that we do have a supply chain in Canada in manufacturing, and that's a positive thing. So I wouldn't say that it's a pivot from it. I think it's just more a realization from our government that we have this great Canadian company that is delivering automation worldwide for life science product, and particularly in a situation where, you know, Canadian hospitals need PPE, ATS was able to step in and be able to access their global technology to support Canadian and our Canadian hospitals.
Peng, I want to stay with you on this next question. And I want to telescope out a little bit here from the point of view of the Canadian economy. Mm-hmm. From your vantage point, are you seeing any gaps exposed as a result of, you know, the COVID-19 pandemic lockdown? And in particular, are there any groups that are more, let's say, exposed as a result of the pandemic?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so from a purely commercial point of view, or from a business point of view, you know, I think the biggest gap that we realize, or at least with our government, and I was working with a different group of within our federal government and our provincial government, is the realization that we have a huge gap in our supply chain on some really key components in terms of being able to produce our own technology or products to deal with COVID-19. So for example, we have a number of Canadian ventilators in Canada, but some of the key components, we don't have Canadian suppliers. So there's a massive gap there that we have to address quickly. When I say we, I'm thinking, you know, the federal government and provincial government need to deal with building up our Canadian manufacturing sector again. It's over the years, as everybody's seen and heard, we've lost a lot of Canadian manufacturing jobs in Canada, lost a lot of manufacturing capabilities. In fact, when I owned my company, Transformix Engineering, for 24 years, we purposely did not sell in Canada just because the market was just too small for us. So we went outside and sold globally. And I think the realization with COVID-19 was we as a country need to do something. For those of us who've been in this sector for a long time, this is what I've been preaching, that we need to build up our manufacturing sector for many, many years. And I think it's gone, you know, I would say completely ignored, but it hasn't been a particular important initiative. COVID-19 has really opened up that wound to say, yeah, as a country, we need a supply chain to protect our people in a situation where the borders are being shut down. And, you know, our natural resources are great when times are great, but it doesn't help in a situation where we need vaccine, we need, you know, protective gears, we need ventilators, on it goes. And there were nights that I was working with a couple of companies and scrambling to look for basic components that we can't get from Canadian manufacturers. With respect to citizens, I mean, I don't think there's anything new for those of us who are not affected by, that are able to work remote. We've been very lucky. Our financially hasn't been impact, but I think it's impact a lot of people that are work more manual, where they have to physically be in a location. And I feel bad for those families because they are definitely hurt by what's happening. And it's a difficult situation for a lot of family. Sorry, you're muted.
Shamira, thanks. Shamira, the
Yeah.
same question, but I'm going to add, one of the audience members asked about professional immigrants and the impact on COVID-19 over the next year. So how would you anticipate how that segment's going to be impacted?
Sure. So, you know, in terms of early in the pandemic, as soon as the pandemic happened, we basically started looking at which sectors were going to be impacted the most almost immediately, because we had done some studies to understand individuals who were coming to Canada, what sectors they were working in. And so we saw almost immediately that the sectors that people were coming to work in, because these were jobs where they could get in fairly quickly, whether it was accommodation, hospitality, retail, those are the sectors that got decimated. And so we already knew that the impact was going to be on the most vulnerable populations, immigrants, refugees, racialized women, et cetera, et cetera. So we already knew that, and we knew that from the perspective of the work that West does to try and reduce barriers and to try and at least make sure that people didn't end up with nothing. We started working with some umbrella organizations like COSTI, TRIAC, OCASI, and I'm giving you acronyms, but these are organizations that are associations that get together and provide services. So what we wanted to do is to understand the impact and to see what we could do. So that was really at the macro level. When we went deeper in terms of, you know, what was the impact and what could be done, we realized that the biggest impact, and we all saw it playing out in front of us, was in the long-term care sector, where you basically had the number of seniors who were getting infected and those in the front line getting infected. And so we thought, here's an opportunity really for those highly trained health professionals who wanted to work in this sector. The door was sort of a bit ajar, and could they go in and basically work in this particular sector? So we know that there was uptake. So that's generally the health sector. The question that you're asking around immigrant professionals, unfortunately, what we also did see, so I'll do the unfortunately, and then, you know, let's see where we go next. So what we do know with respect to the whole concept of last in and first out, that happened immediately, because as soon as sectors basically started closing down, those who had come in at the end were losing their jobs. However, what we do know is that in areas, as Peng just talked about, if you're in the finance area, IT, you know, where you could work from home remotely, no issues. Where you were in the front line, it was hard to get back in. And so one of the things that we did do at WES is provided some sponsorship funds to OCASI to try and support individuals who maybe didn't meet the criteria for employment insurance, or they wouldn't be eligible for the federal stimulus packages. So at least, you know, people could stay whole for a little bit as they looked at what the next steps were. For the immigrant professional, I think that what we have seen is the economy is starting to recover slowly as we've gone into the 2 phases of businesses opening up. There are systemic changes in the labor market. You know, I've just talked to you about WES and how we have digitized, which has an implication in terms of the functions that people used to play, which we can now pivot to, you know, something else where we could use the knowledge and skills. And so to the individual who's asking that question, I believe there will be an opportunity. We have our demographic profile in Canada generally, where you have more people retiring, and more people will retire as a result of the pandemic if they felt like, okay, enough, I just need to now leave. Not enough young people coming into the system, into the labor market. We'll need immigrants, but we have 1 million people who came over the last 3 years who are here already, and we can basically leverage the skills as we wait for the borders to open up. So I'm hoping I answered the question of the individual who asked a simple question, but a complex answer.
Absolutely. And Ian, I mean, you sit in a company that has global operations. So from a bird's eye view, you probably have purview into different countries and how they're responding. How do you view the gaps here in Canada relative to other countries?
Yeah, it's interesting, you know, looking at other countries and Canada's response. And, you know, for my own story, I'm like a new Canadian in that I emigrated here first when I was 3 with my parents. And then after 18 years away, coming back home and just looking at some of the complementarity and differences from other countries that I've worked in. I do think, you know, one of the very interesting nuances within Canada is, as Peng mentioned, around there's of course lower local manufacturing capacity, and also as recent kind of events and activities have kind of unfolded, the overdependence upon the U.S. and that, of course, you know, some of those challenges, independency both as the biggest market opportunity, but then some of those supply linkages. So, you know, when I'm looking at continental Europe and even with Britain, still part of the EU, at least from a trade capacity, you know, looking at kind of the more integration of markets and free flowing of goods and a bit more of that resilience. So I do think, you know, that there are, you know, this call to action about, you know, how's Canada going to be able to either boost its local manufacturing, diversify some of its trade relationships to make sure that critical supplies are going to be available in real time, and that you know, sadly, the demand that we have may not be as high as other countries, and the market attractiveness. So we might be a part of a very long queue when we're talking about, you know, scarcity of supply. So, you know, brilliant job, you know, that the government has done and that companies have done as well with, you know, rising to the challenge for that big surge in local manufacturing. And I love that statistic around, you know, 25% of companies have some way, you know, adjusted to support the pandemic. And I do think, you know, that really goes to the very unique community nature of Canada, and, you know, really kind of leaning in when the chips were down.
Ian, I'm going to stay with you on this next audience question. It's a bit of a concern, really, and that is the federal government just announced a deficit of $353 billion, which is pretty significant compared to last year. Are you worried at all that as we come out of this COVID-19, I mean, that's going to have an impact on us Canadians in terms of our taxes, potentially on jobs as well? Any concerns on your part with that huge number?
It's a great question. And I think, you know, when we kind of look at, and going back to your earlier question around Canada relative to other countries, and I appreciate, you know, very much that, you know, Canada has higher taxes than many other countries. But I do feel that, you know, that's actually now been put to the test of saying, you know, what are the additional public services that we get, you know, as a result of it. And, yes, it's going to be a medium term, or depends how close that medium term is going to encroach for here. But I do think it's that, heavy investment to help us get through a very, very rocky few months, to strengthen the health system, to allow that kind of breathing space for the industries to be able to adapt and react and make some of these changes that we've heard about. Otherwise, it would have been, exponentially worse. And we're seeing, how other countries who haven't taken that type of action or taken it as serious, how, their road to recovery is going to be much longer. The debt might be a bit smaller, but, the overall cost I expect will be quite significant, both in, lost opportunity, as well as, long-term kind of impact on the health of the population.
Great. Shamira, I'm going to punt this next audience question over to you. Anne is asking about all three of your organizations, but I'll start with you. What has your organization done, if anything, to bring youth into the workforce during this pandemic lockdown?
Youth, that's actually a really good question, Darrell, because it's something that we have been looking at. Youth isn't necessarily a target group that we work with. And so one of the things in terms of the statistics that I talked to you about initially, we knew that women, for example, racialized women were being impacted. But when we started looking at the statistics, sort of maybe early June, we knew that the unemployment rate had gone up to just under 15% for the general population. For youth working age, it was about 24%. But when we looked at racialized youth, it was almost 48% in certain communities.
Wow.
And that was shocking, because although the sample size was small, it was very telling in terms of we're going to lose generations if we don't do something in this particular area. So, one of the things that we are doing at World Education Services, and I don't have the results as yet, is just doing an e-scan to understand what we are doing basically for youth generally, which I know a lot of organizations are doing. But what are we doing for marginalized or racialized youth who basically are not going to stand a chance if we don't get them back into the education system, if that's what's required, or training, retraining, etc., to get back into the workforce, because we cannot lose that generation. So that's work that we are doing at this point, and then we will come up with some concrete ways to move forward. It may be partnering with other organizations, it might be galvanizing groups to come together to have a conversation. It may mean through our funding program to provide funding to do some work in that area. So that's still at this point preliminary in terms of the data that we have.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, maybe I'd love to add just one point around that. And, coming back to, vulnerable populations and, private sector response. The other one that, of course, or the other incident on top of the health and economic pandemic that's really come to the forefront is, the increased awareness in Canada around racism and the call to action to do more about it. And this, we talk about, once in a generation. This is something equally as powerful. Not since the 60s have we seen this amount of seriousness about coming to terms, both with the history as well as trying to find new opportunities to create an even stronger, more inclusive culture within Canada. And what I've been very inspired, just as I mentioned, for the private sector response, for supporting employees and trying to minimize some of the job losses initially, and then of course the repositioning, the same thing around companies really stepping forward, standing against racism. And this was usually one of those taboo topics that we don't talk about, but now kind of in the current environment, it's really leading with the values, having purpose-driven companies talking about, no, this is what we stand for. And we'll be trying to find those measures around how can we try to create those opportunities for a more inclusive workforce, and trying to address where some of those gaps may exist for those first couple steps forward.
Peng, anything to add?
With respect to what ATS is doing to support youth?
Mm-hmm.
I to be fair to them, I'm not in head office to know what they're doing. I imagine not too much doing this COVID-19 because of budget constraint in a time like this. Because it's COVID-19, it has a major impact in, you know, in all companies, in all corporations, in terms of the fear factors and risk factor of what's happening in the economy. And as an automation company, your business is very dependent on consumers buying. And if consumers aren't buying, companies are not buying automation equipment to build whatever widget it is. And so I don't think, I think there's a bit of a hiring freeze in our company right now.
Sure. We have an audience member watching on YouTube who sent this question in, and Peng, I'll stick with you on this one.
Sure.
So how concerned should we be with the current COVID situation in the USA? And will this have an impact on Canadian recovery, especially when it comes to supply chains? I mean, we're so interconnected. What's your view on the situation in the US and impact on us here?
It's frightening. I think it's scary. And when you look at what's happening in the US, to your point, they're such a huge trade partners. And, even just everything in terms of Canada and the US, it's like watching big brother refusing to get better when they're sick and helpless, that there's nothing you can do, knowing that he impacts your family. And to me, that's what's happening watching the US right now. It's a huge concern for me personally. I think it impacts the Canadian economy. Just within our organizations, we looked at, because we have divisions in different parts of the US, and just basic things like being able to travel for meetings, or even clients worrying about where the machine's being built because they're worried that if it's built in Canada and we ship it to the US, we can't send our Canadian technicians in there. These are not issues that we had to deal with prior to COVID-19. And I think the Canadian government has done a really good job in terms of shutting down the border, hunkering down. I think Canadian in general, there are pockets of, I don't know what to call them, that, I'm not sure why we're fighting over why we should or shouldn't wear a mask. It's so ridiculous that I just don't even comprehend that attitude. But I think, we have a smaller pocket of those people than in the US, where your leadership is telling the rest of the country to not listen to the experts and the scientists. That country is in trouble. And we being, the smaller neighbor, we'd be foolish to not worry about how it's going to impact us over the long term. And it's, we can shut down our border, but how long can that go on before it truly hurt our economy, our supply chain, and our food supply chain, and on it go? When do we start seeing the price going up? I mean, these are all things that are frightening. I'm less concerned about the pandemic, increasing, Americans coming in and increasing the rate of infection in Canada because of the border being shut down. But I'm definitely worried for our economy and our supply chain, as simple as things as food. So.
Shamira, anything to add to that in terms of the US reaction to COVID versus, here in Canada, and what you see?
I'll speak to more individuals and what's happening, and what we're seeing at WES is that, Canada, and we're very fortunate, we have very progressive immigration policies. So even in terms of post-secondary students or international students coming in, the government made the decision that as long as our borders are closed, international students could take online courses and they would be credited for basically that time when they came over. What's happening in the US is, as a result of the not so great immigration policies and otherwise, we're starting to see a lot more individuals who would have stayed in the States, wanting to come to Canada. So in fact, as we look at our source countries, it's been really interesting for us to see the number of applications from the US, which is pretty unusual. So if anything, we're benefiting from the talent. We used to worry about our talent going to the US, and it's reversing. So in a way, it's good news for us. We've seen it through the WES application process. And, as Peng said, I'm not actually sure whether they understand in the US with the kind of policies. I know it's all political, but ultimately, it's an economy that's eroding. And it was world class one day, and we're starting to play a very significant leadership role in terms of who wants to come here, and they're going to contribute to our economy, and we'll be leaders next. We're small, I get that, but it's going to be fascinating in terms of what's been happening. So, I look forward to November, and let's see what happens.
Fingers crossed.
Well, I mean, it's a real positive sign that talent is coming up north. I mean, we've always complained about a brain drain historically here in Canada, and to see the reverse of that is a wonderful thing. A reminder again to the audience that you can type your questions into the Q&A tab on Zoom or the chat box on YouTube if you're watching. Ian, anything to add to that, sort of the US?
Yeah, maybe one other thing. I completely agree with what's being said about the draw of Canada and coming back, and I just compliment part of that especially as we look at the tech industry. It's not just top talent coming to Canada for the better quality of life, the more kind of community feel versus a bit of the individualism we see in the States. It's the money's coming to Canada. So we see the amount of investments that are actually shifting here to develop, especially our artificial intelligence capabilities, new startup ventures and beyond. I think that's extremely exciting about saying that, the world's realizing, that we've got the proximity of the US, but something very, very unique. And that, that pool of diversity and very progressive immigration policy means that we can draw in the best minds in the world. And then that's what's required in order to advance, especially high tech being, one of those key industries, propelling the future.
All right, so Ian, I'm going to stick with you on this because you mentioned that high tech as an opportunity. Now, as we turn the corner with COVID-19, and we're still not there yet, but if you were to take a crystal ball out and try and make some predictions about where you think these opportunities might be in the short term, and then once the vaccine is found in the longer term, this disruption has got to have some positive outcomes down the road. What are your views on that?
Yeah, so obviously, I think the demand for tech talent right now, and the demand for tech departments to support activities in big companies, is at an all-time high. A lot of the kind of investments that have been pushed off of saying, not just now, we'll get to it with the digital transformation at a future date. I think that's really, really been spiking. So absolutely, when I talk about tech, it's both opportunities kind of in pure tech companies as well as within any industry or not-for-profits and government as well. So absolutely, from my vantage point, that's one of the booming areas. The other interesting one is we look at some of the global trends, and we're doing a lot of work with the World Economic Forum in Geneva about what's next post-COVID. And one of the mega trends, which is quite interesting, and we're probably seeing a bit of that here, is the de-urbanization of trying to push a bit more local. We talk about a bit more national activities, that can happen around Canada be self-sustaining. But what I do think is going to be interesting when we kind of get through this is, are we going to see a surge of more dare I say, suburbs or smaller towns with lower population densities and more entrepreneurial opportunities happening there? And how's that going to start to manifest? So I think, from that side, there will be, more of those small business opportunities and growth opportunities. They just may not be, in some of the big cities or kind of the feeder industries to just some of the big cities. We might be able to work a bit more remotely and distributed, across different regions rather than just in, tech hubs here and there, or, financial concentration here in Toronto.
So that's really interesting, Ian. So, one thing COVID-19 has forced us to do is learn how to work remotely much more efficiently than prior to this disruption. From a global perspective, that's happening all over the world. Do you think there'll be pressure on Canada, let's say working in Saskatoon versus working in Mumbai, India, right? There's this ability now to work remotely, much more accepted. How much global pressure do you think there will be once we come out of this, for this easy ability from a tech perspective to be anywhere?
I think it's going to be the default. That's what we're starting to do. And as I mentioned kind of earlier, what I'm really excited about, is that global pool of talent, and that can be tapped into. Within Accenture, we've gone through our own transformation very recently, and I love the way our CEO talks about this. It's around skills as currency. And I think that works for us as a company. So wherever the right skills are anywhere within the firm, they need to be in the right place at the right time. But I think we can expand that for the broader markets so that, I can be working and co-creating something with a developer in Hyderabad, as well as a UX designer in Brazil in real time. And we've proven it works. So I do think, not just on the technology and product development, I was just using that as an example, but more collaboration, more insights. And what's also very interesting from an impact perspective around looking at not-for-profits and beyond, I'm extremely excited about co-creation with communities. Now, again, there are some limitations to getting access and beyond, but, when we're looking at impact programs that are supposed to be human-centered and beyond, we've now kind of opened up, some of these kind of closed opportunities for, you've got to fly to a conference, or you've got to be in a big city, or you've got to be X, Y, and Z. So the chance to actually start co-creating with communities or co-creating with customers, I think is really going to, start to catalyze a new wave of innovation as we go forward, and better results, better impact, better programs, better products and services from companies through that tighter proximity between customers and companies, or communities and not-for-profits.
Darrell, can I add a few comments to that? Because, just based on what Ian has said, the way we work is going to change so substantially that, in fact, your education or where you were born or what your ethnic background is not going to be relevant. What's going to be relevant is what you can do in terms of your skills to basically, grow products, design services, do research, etc. So that actually becomes very different. It's what technology companies have been saying. It doesn't matter what your education background is. It's what are the skills and how can you pivot your skills and transfer them to something else. So that already is going to change. Secondly, from my perspective, in terms of what we now know we can do remotely, even when you think about regulated occupations, whether it's in the health field or in other areas where the requirement is to be in a location to demonstrate your skills on a machine or whatever else, you don't need to do that anymore, because you can do it remotely using the concept of gamification, where you put a problem statement on and the individual just goes through a process, and AI will be able to tell us through algorithms whether they've taken the right steps and how long it took and whether they got to an endpoint. So in my mind, as much as COVID has had a significant negative impact, I see from an opportunity perspective that it gave us an opportunity to think about things and the way we do things very differently. And so coming back to the 1 million immigrants that we had over the last 3 years, what we do know is that majority either had bachelor's or master's, and yet they couldn't go back into their fields because of all these various barriers. And here's a way to do things differently to demonstrate what they can do, even while they're still overseas waiting to get their applications to be processed. So, you know, I think it's a great opportunity for the future.
And I do want to add too, Darrell, that on the manufacturing side, you know, there is going to be tremendous opportunities as companies are looking for flexible technologies that are able to adapt to produce different variants for a smaller market, if they're looking at nationalizing the market instead of the international market. So there's a lot of changes I think is going to happen as well in our industry, just purely from a manufacturing point of view, that there'll be a lot more digital technologies being introduced. We've been talking about Industry 4.0 for many years now, and prior to COVID-19, I was an advocate to say it's going to take a long time because companies are not communicating on the front end and the back end to be able to make IoT work. But I think with what's happening in COVID-19, because of what's forcing all of us to do and look at what's happening, I think it's going to push it a lot faster. And we don't have a choice but to automate a lot of the process that require people in a factory. And you know, we see that as well in terms of the rate of infection for people that are working in factory that are tightly packed. And so automations will increase and grow because of that. So technology is going to be a big part moving forward. It's always been, but I think it's going to be more so.
Yeah, and just one other point on that, because I think it's such a you know, fascinating point that you raised there, Peng, around automation, and Shamira, bringing together what you were saying about disproportionately impact youth and vulnerable populations. As you've all probably, you know, seen, the gig economy is not living up to, you know, its potential as the opportunity to create meaningful, always you know, sustainable you know, paths forward for a lot of people. So when we look at automation as, you know, one of the examples, when we look at, you know, some of the kind of reduction in jobs that are going to be out there, we've got to think differently about how do people become more resilient, more adaptable to move through their lives for different jobs and beyond. Because I do feel like you know, what we're seeing, and you know, as we're talking about the U.S. And also, you know, coming from the U.K. This focus upon, you know, trying to bring back the old jobs just doesn't work because they don't exist. So, you know, we can go against outsourcing and manufacturing, or, you know, we can go against automation, but it's going to eventually happen. So we need to really have a smart, informed conversation of, let's focus on how do we build the next generation of jobs, or the attributes, as Shamira mentioned, so that people can move between jobs as we go forward. And I don't think that there's been enough dialogue or deep thought around, let's accept it. I know it's a hard truth to accept, and then we can solution, because that's what we do, you know, as humans,
Yes.
and finding some of the new options to move forward.
Yeah, and my analogy to something like that, Ian, that I've been talking about for a while within my sector, is that it's no different than farming back in, you know, the 20s or 30s, where it's like a family and everybody's working on the farm, and eventually machines taking over, and you learn how to have new skills, right? So it's you know, you need a paradigm shift within our society to say, you know, the traditional manufacturing job isn't there. But there's a lot of opportunities for those that are interested in the science and the math and the engineering, because those are the skill sets. And in fact, you know, globally, it doesn't matter which clients I speak to in the world, there is a shortage of skilled people. So, you know, young people that are looking at what am I going to do? Well, think manufacturing, but think high-end sophisticated manufacturing, not your dirty, you know, labor sort of job. And Ian brought over an excellent point. And, you know, we as a society has to start looking at it differently and said, automation isn't taking over. We need to work with automation to improve our overall experience in the job environment. It's just a different skill sets. And it starts with our education system.
I want to squeeze one question in. There's so many questions from the audience. We were not going to get a chance to go to all of them. But there's a gentleman, John, who really appreciates the conversation so far. We've talked about immigration and diversity. We did touch on racism. Ian, you brought it up in relation to the US. What John wants to know is, how are either your organizations in particular, but the Canadian response in terms of our corporate world. How are we going to respond to combat racism systemically now, once we get through this COVID? Well, now, plus when we get through COVID. Ian, maybe I'll let you start on this one.
Yeah, it's interesting because unfortunately, and so sad and tragically, it's been so many incidents happening within the U.S. I do think, but there's the shaking fists and frustration, but then kind of continuation of the previous practices are not actually any of those significant changes. What I would say is I really, really believe that this time is different. Everyone I've spoken with, so many CEOs are speaking out about this. They're starting to work on commitments around the same way, like for instance, us as Accenture, where we had made this goal years ago around getting to equal on gender parity, that by 2025, and again, we're a tech company with 500,000 people, we're going to start to find ways to even invest early stream to get more girls studying STEM so that they can have jobs in technology. And then of course, from there, you're making sure that any of these systemic kind of challenges for keeping women in the workforce, those are being addressed. So we're taking, for example, looking at our own company, taking that same logic and that same success and momentum that we've had to focus upon marginalized and underrepresented communities. So it's about really trying to figure out, is there any unconscious bias that's happening within recruitment? What does our mix look like? Because we have a lot of diversity at junior levels. How do we create those opportunities, those mentors, the coaches to help people from minority backgrounds to reach the next level, beyond the programmers or into the managers, into the executives. It's those types of kind of structural changes that we're looking at in a serious way. And it's not just us. A lot of our clients are, making those conversations. If you look at the Harvard Business Review, there's so many articles coming out around, advice and tactics and programs that can actually happen to make sure that companies really, take a stand, not just take a stand out of this and make those commitments, take tangible actions on what they can do to make sure that it's an inclusive workforce at all levels, from, new joiner, maintenance, all the way up to C-suite and board.
Great. It's such a big topic, but Peng or Shamira, anything to add to how your organizations are combating?
Well, I think, Ian,
go ahead,
there are specific companies that are taking initiative, and to your point, I think more companies are comfortable in speaking up against racism. But I think the unfortunate thing in Canada is that we like to pat ourselves on the back and go, we're not like them, like we are not racist. But the reality thing is that I consider Canadian racism to be just more hidden. And, this COVID-19, particularly in a community where I am, that there's not a lot of minority, I'm seeing a lot more racism that are coming out that are ugly. And I don't know that we as a country have addressed it well, because we look south and we think, oh my gosh, it's so horrible, it's so ugly, I can't believe those people. We're not that. Well, you're right, we're not as obvious. We are more the quiet racism where we are nice to your face and then treat you differently behind your back. And I think that makes me realize more than anything is to be on social media, on Facebook, with people that you would not suspect that they are. But when people support certain statements or certain cause or certain individual politicians, that tells me one thing about them. And although as much as we like to pat ourselves in the back, I think we need to dig deeper and truly look at ourselves and say, no, we're not better, we're just nicer about it and not as overt because we don't like confrontation. And I think in many ways, that's worse for minorities because it's not out front and we're not addressing it. And Ian, I'm not taking away from anything you said. I am sure there are corporations that are speaking out against it. With the Black Lives Matter, I did reach out to my company president and said, look, we need to speak out. We are a multinational, we need to take a stand, and kudos to them. They did take a stand and they did, put something up on social media. And that's step one, right? Step two is to seriously look at what we are doing as a society, as individuals, as corporation, and how are we going to fix the deep-rooted problems that is racism, that we don't want to talk about it because we think we're better. But in my opinion, I don't think we are. And it frightens me.
Shamira, I'll give you the last word.
Well, I mean, I used to be the Chief Diversity Officer for the province of Ontario, 62,000 people. A complex issue that's going to take another whole hour to have a discussion on. The only thing that I'm going to say is that both Ian and Peng, were very articulate in terms of its subtle racism. Everybody has biases. Ian talked about that. It's basically sometimes intentions are great. The impact is terrible. And in my mind, I think that we need to look at the root causes and hold people accountable. Statements are great. It's been amazing with these statements. But so what are the next steps and how are we going to really make a difference? And it takes a much more authentic conversation than saying, yeah, we're going to do something, and beautiful letters and statements that come out. Mm-hmm. So, you got me passionate about this. Again, a separate conversation. Racism exists. Everybody has biases. We just need to understand how to talk about this in an authentic manner.
I wish we had more time because this has been an amazing conversation. Unfortunately, the hour has gone by, it's flown by. So stay on, but before we get to closing remarks, I'd like to give the floor back to Selvin to make an announcement.
Sure, thank you, Darrell. I'd like to make a quick announcement on an initiative that the G.O.A Toronto has launched a month ago. And everybody is familiar with the food bank, but having said that, there is a dire need to support the food bank given the current conditions today. So we have an initiative, a campaign that's running till the end of the month, whereby we're trying to sponsor meals. So far, we have raised we sponsored about 23,000 meals, and we're trying to get to 50,000 if possible, if we can get to. But we also have a Mask for a Meal initiative where we have seniors in the community sewing masks to be sold, and all the proceeds go towards the food banks. And so far, these ladies ranging from age of 70 to 85 have raised about $14,000 approximately, and about close to 1,000 masks. So for more information, feel free to reach out to the link that's provided or to our website, goatoronto.com. And thank you again. Thanks, Darrell.
Thanks so much, Selvin. That's a great initiative, and hopefully you'll surpass the goal. So listen, I want to thank Shamira, Ian, and Peng for a wonderful conversation today, sharing their experience and insights with us. I'm sure everyone benefited from a few things that you've shared today. I want to also thank New Canadians and G.O.A Toronto for co-hosting this. And a reminder that you can follow New Canadians on several social media channels, and you can keep on top of the next segment, which they do weekly. So I think it's next Tuesday is their next episode. You can also subscribe to their newsletter at the link on the webpage in front of you. And lastly, a reminder to those people watching via Zoom, there'll be a quick survey that will follow this, so please complete that. New Canadians really relies on your input to improve their programming over time. So once again, thank you all. Have yourself a good evening.